I am absolutely humbled to make this presentation here today about being a company secretary that is not an attorney. Many people find it strange, right? But I just want to share, I'll get right into the presentation and you can see where we will talk about the history of the company secretary. Yes, if we can go to the overview. Yes, so this is what I'll be covering today, the history of the company secretary, basically how the company secretary was seen in the past and its development into how the company secretary is seen now. The role and function of the company secretary, right, its importance to the organization, the responsibilities of the company secretary that emanates from its primary role and function, qualification and skills of the company secretary. And in there, you will see that it is not necessary for a company secretary to be an attorney at law. And also the independence of the company secretary. What are some of these threats to the independence of the company secretary that is so important to maintain for the organization, for the integrity of the position, right? Throughout the presentation, I am going to draw on some of my experiences in corporate life. I would not be mentioning any institutions by name because I really just want to draw on the issues, use my experiences, but focus on the issues instead of any particular organization or group of persons. So let's go on to the next slide. Right, and look at this. In 1887, in this particular case, Barnett Hawes and Company versus South London Tramways Company. This is what Lord Esher said. A company secretary is a mere servant. His position is that he is to do what he is told, and no person can assume that he has any authority to represent anything at all. So this was a view in 1887, note the year. So unlike the modern company secretary, the 19th century secretary has a purely administrative function, no responsibilities or duties recognized in legislation, right? So, and I would actually admit in some organizations that I've worked at, unfortunately, this is still a view, not by the majority, but this is still a view that a company secretary is simply to do what he is told, a mere servant. So let's move on to how far we've come from here. The Companies Act in 1948 of the UK, right? Significant changes took place through this piece of legislation. In that particular legislation, the company secretary was recognized as an officer of the company with authority to do certain acts on behalf of the company. All companies were required to appoint a company secretary, and you see where our local law in Trinidad and Tobago has adopted some of these elements of this 1948 Act in the UK. Under this piece of legislation, the company secretary is authorized to sign prescribed forms on behalf of the company secretary. That was not the case before, right? Company secretary is authorized to make statutory declarations as to matters of fact concerning the company. That was not the case before. Company secretary may incur personal responsibility for not complying with requirements of the Act that affect the company. So you see here, there's a level of risk that is associated with the responsibility, right? Personal risk as well. Even in our TT law and even some of the legislations that would guide certain enterprises, certain state enterprises in Trinidad and Tobago, there is personal responsibility for failure to comply with certain elements of the law as it affects the company for the company secretary herself, right? So there's you see the jump from 1887 to 1948. Granted, it took a long time. 1887 to 1948 is many years. So that may have something to do with why certain views of the 19th century is probably still entrenched in some of us as to the role of the company secretary. So let's go on to the next slide. 1971. Note the distinction of what Lord Denning is saying versus what Lord Esher said in 1887 in this particular case. A company secretary is a much more important person nowadays than he was in 1887, right? Because we had the 1948 piece of legislation in between that. He is an officer of the company with extensive duties and responsibilities. This appears not only in Companies Acts, but also by the role which he plays in the day-to-day business of companies. So yes, we had the legislation outlining the new responsibilities of the secretary, but even in the day-to-day business of the company, what does the company secretary do when we sit in a boardroom and advise our chairman and our executive directors and our non-executive directors? What do we do in the day-to-day business of companies, right? So you see that responsibility, and with responsibility comes risk, right? So even in just what we do on a day-to-day basis confirms the importance and the significance of the company secretary to an organization. He is no longer a mere clerk. Right? I do remember I was training under a company secretary, because before I actually became a company secretary being promoted in the organization, I would have acted as company secretary from time to time. So I remember in exchange, a handoff between a company secretary and myself when I was supposed to act, I was actually told, Ceronne, we just follow instructions, and it just didn't sit well with me. Even though I wasn't the company secretary yet or anything like that, it didn't sit well with me, because at that point, many years ago, I was of the view like, but the company secretary advises the board. There's that advisory function. So to just follow instructions seems a bit counterproductive. And I don't think that is the case anymore. I think that is a 19th century position of 1887, and it has no place. So let us go on to the next slide. Further recognition as a responsible officer under a series of legislation. So if you look at these pieces of legislation from UK law, the Trade Descriptions Act of 1968, the Taxes Management Act of 1970, the Unsolicited Goods Act of 1971. I won't go into too many details as to what these acts are about, but it gives, under each piece of legislation, it gives the company secretary even more responsibilities to act on behalf of the company. And in TT law, in our Companies Act of 1995, you will see where we would have adopted some of the provisions of the UK 1948 Act, right? Section 61, allow me to read out Section 61 of our Companies Act 1995. Section 61, subsection 1, every company shall have a secretary. It's not discretionary. Every company shall have a secretary and may have one or more assistant secretaries, who or each of whom shall be appointed by the directors, or if provision is made in the bylaws of a company for the appointment in accordance with that provision, and B, may be an individual, a body corporate, or firm. So my consulting company, my consulting firm is actually come on record as company secretary for one particular firm. Subsection 2, if a company carries on business for more than 1 month without complying with subsection 1, the company and every officer of the company who is in default is guilty of an offense. So you see, our local legislation, Companies Act 1995, places a responsibility on every single company in operation, private, public, now formed, to have a company secretary and not to carry on business without one. So in my experience, I don't think many, especially private companies that are now being formed, I don't think they're fully aware of subsection 2. So a company would form and we would list our directors, we'd have our address, and we would have but the secretary usually comes after. But you are not to carry on business for more than 1 month without complying with subsection 1, which is to appoint a secretary. So sometimes if I have to incorporate a company, we address the issue of the company secretary one time. Right, next slide. So the role and function of the company secretary, right? Now that we're in a position of responsibility, the key role of company secretaries in good corporate governance is now recognized, not just in legislation, but in various reports, right? In the UK, you had the Cadbury report of many years ago, which has now led to the UK Corporate Governance Code of 2018, recently revised. So it's now recognized in various reports, recommendations, various codes across the globe. So we have the UK Corporate Governance Code, right, which now we are actually, I'm seeing similarities between the TT code that we started in 2013, which is soon to be revised. I'm seeing a lot of similarities and things coming out from, in our code, from the UK Corporate Governance Code. And what does the code say? All directors, what does the UK code say? All directors should have access to the advice of our company secretary, who is responsible for advising the board on all governance matters. So, advisor to the chair and the board, not just someone to take instructions or to take notes. The company secretary is the vanguard of the company. I like to refer to the vanguard as the conscience of the company, right? So it is that arm that seeks to protect the company, right? What should the board do with all the information that is coming before it, right? Legal as well, but not just legal information, all the information. What should the company do in a particular circumstance? How does this particular action affect stakeholders? So the company secretary is there to really assist the board in carrying out its mandate for the best of the company. Note the duty is owed to the company. Section 99 of the Companies Act 1995, Trinidad and Tobago law. Every director and officer of the company secretary is an officer of the company, shall, in exercising his powers and discharging his duties, act honestly and in good faith with a view to the best interests of the company. And I've underlined and bold company because you're going to see where certain threats to the position of the company secretary would seek to compromise that position, compromise the duty that the secretary owes to the company and not to any particular individual. And Section 99, subsection B also says, every director and officer of the company shall, in exercising his powers and discharging his duties, exercise the care, diligence, and skill that a reasonably prudent person would exercise in comparable circumstances. So, but the point here is that in exercising our duties and powers and discharging our functions, our duty is owed to the company. I think that's very important to remember and to keep with us as we go along in our profession as company secretaries. And next slide. So the duties of the company is not necessarily specified in legislation, but may be determined by each company according to its size and complexity. So the legislation would state the importance of the position, you must have the position, but each organization could specify what the duties should be. In my experience, duties were classified into these three categories: governance, compliance, communication, engagement. So governance really supporting the board in governing the organization. Governance is really under the jurisdiction of the board, right? And I like to separate governance from day-to-day management, right? Management, depending on the size of the company, a larger company, there'll be that separation from the duties of the senior management and the governance duties of the board. In smaller companies, they tend to be one and the same because the board really are the ones managing the day-to-day operations of the company. But as the company grows, there has to be that distinction between governance and day-to-day management. So compliance and as well as communication and engagement. Next slide. Governance. Helping the board establish necessary policies, processes, information, time, and resources to function effectively and efficiently, supporting the board committees. Now, remember, depending on the size of the organization, you may not be required, you may not be able to have a committee. If you have a new company with just the minimum of 2 directors, it's difficult to have a committee, right? So all of these duties, as I said before, is really dependent on the size and complexity of the organization, right? Compliance is where you really see you have to have knowledge of the law. I know that this presentation is called the non-legal company secretary, and while you may not need to be an attorney, I do believe you need to have knowledge of law, right? But not necessarily be called to the bar and be an attorney at law. Right? There are a variety of professions in the legal profession, in the legal field, and the company secretary is one of them. But the company secretary and an attorney need not be the same, be the same thing. And when I get further into the presentation, you will see actually one of the threats to the independence of the company secretary, I think, is that dual role of general counsel and corporate secretary, which I see a lot of. Right, but there are certain threats and risks in holding that position. Next slide. Qualifications, and here you will see in legislation that you need not be an attorney at law to be a company secretary. A company secretary of a private company need not have any professional or other qualification, nor have any experience. I mean, that is what the law says. I'm going to make a point further on when I'm discussing the risk of the dual role of the general counsel and company secretary. I'm going to make a point regarding that, even though this is legislation. The qualifications of a company secretary of a public company are governed by Section 63. So a public company is where the shares are listed on a stock exchange, right? The public is investing money into the organization. So there's a greater need for that company to be regulated. There's a greater need for the company secretary to have to have certain qualifications, right? So these are the persons, and note I put or at the end of each. A person who on the commencement date held the office of secretary, assistant secretary, or deputy secretary of a public company, or a person who for at least 3 years of the 5 years immediately preceding his appointment as secretary held the office of secretary of a public company, or a person who is in good standing of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Trinidad and Tobago. A chartered accountant can be a company secretary. The Association of Chartered Secretaries or Administrators of Trinidad and Tobago, or the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy, or a person who is an attorney at law, or a person by virtue of his holding or having held any other position or having been a member of any other body appears to be capable. So this more or less summarizes what the legislation states that the qualifications of a company secretary of a public company should have. And, so there's a myth that a company secretary must be an attorney. And I think this Section 63 should clearly address that myth, that you need not be, you could be any one of these persons to become a company secretary. Yeah, and even so for a private company, it's even less of a requirement for a private company. Although I would argue that company secretaries, even for a private company, should go beyond the bare minimum of the legislation. Right, so next slide. The required skills and attributes. Interpersonal skills, very, very, very important. The company secretary needs to be able to build and maintain relationships of trust, confidence, and respect. There are different persons, different groups that we must interact with, and we must be able to have the trust, confidence, and respect of all of these groups. There's the chairman, there's the executive director, they're the non-executive director, they are the stakeholders, they are the shareholders, and we have a significant role to play in communicating and engaging with all of these different groups, with different personalities, with different views, different agendas, different motives. So we must be able to build and maintain that respect and trust. And you would find, though, that respect doesn't always mean being liked, right? The company secretaries in the room might attest to the fact that we are not always the most liked persons in the organization, right? Because we seek the benefits of the company, which may many times require us to go against the tide. It may require us to say, okay, it is against what you may personally want, right? But this is for the long-term benefits of the company and the shareholders, right? So while we need to have that interpersonal skills, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be liked by everybody, but you do need to be respected. Fearlessness, right? You will have to go against the tide. We have to go against the tide many, many times because this fearlessness is also linked to the next one, selflessness. Remember, you are in an organization with human beings with their individual frailties, their weaknesses, their motives, agendas, and human beings are by nature, right? If we're honest with ourselves, we're by nature selfish. We want what we want and we want it now, So some of the skills and the attributes of the company secretary is to bring a certain level of logic and reason to tame that desire to want what we want, right? Is it good for the long-term benefit of the company? That is where your duty lies, to the company. And that may not necessarily translate to what even a chairman wants immediately or what a chairman wants right away, Leadership skills. Not only do you have to lead the secretariat, you have your secretariat of staff, and yes, you have to lead your staff, but sometimes you're in a boardroom, you have to exercise those leadership skills, right? Even amongst the board, even amongst the people that you are trying to protect, because at the end of the day, again, human beings. And while, yes, directors are on a board, they know what is supposed to be done. They know what I should do. But many times when you're actually in the day-to-day grind, what we should do doesn't always translate to what we actually want to do. And that temptation is there. That temptation is real to seek self, right? So you have to be able to speak truth to power, is what I'm saying. Emotional intelligence. There are different people around the table, different views, even in your shareholder meetings, different people, different views, different agendas. So you have to be able to exist, and not because we disagree on a particular point means we have to hate each other or we have to become emotional, where sometimes, board meetings emotions could rise and tempers could flare. So many times the secretary is the one to kind of tame the atmosphere of the meeting. And that requires emotional intelligence, commercial and business acumen, right? Essentially, you're helping the board run a business, right? And if it is that the CEO or the executive directors would bring information to the board and would want the board to make decisions based on what they present, the board must be able to understand what is presented, what one must be able to interpret financial statements, and what really is being presented here to me, right? The non-executive directors have a duty and an obligation to provide constructive challenge, right? If it is that you're an accountant in your profession and you're serving on a board, you need to have constructive challenge, and the secretary also must be able to help both the NEDs and the executive directors and the chairman in understanding and interpreting the documents and the reports and the finances that are presented to them. Yeah, so that is important. I would recommend any company secretary to do the MBA. When I did my MBA, it brought all aspects of the organization together. So There's the accounting, there's the HR, there's all the different, there's health and safety, there's law, there's all the aspects, everything that you would meet in a boardroom. I met and I was introduced to during my MBA studies. Next slide. The independence of the secretary. The independence of the secretary must be respected if the secretary is to fulfill his duties to the company as opposed to any individual within the company. That is of critical importance. The secretary is to provide impartial, objective advice, even though it may displease a particular chairman, a particular director, even the chairman maybe, right? So, but we are not here to please everyone, right? We are here to provide impartial, objective advice and help the directors fulfill their duty to serve the company in good faith for the benefit of the members, of the shareholders of the company as a whole. Yeah. So the independence is important. We are no longer simply to take instructions, but there's an advisory role, right? We have to advise the board on what is the correct action to take in the particular circumstance. Next slide. Threats to the independence. Removal of the advisory function. Inappropriate reporting lines. The dual role of the general counsel and the company secretary. Inappropriate remuneration policies and procedures. Inappropriate appointment and termination policies and procedures. The CEO chairs secretary tripartite alliance. I've seen that happen in my professional life. I'll go into more of these in the next slides. Next slide. The advisory function. I've served in organizations where, you know, your advice is not welcome. It wouldn't be welcome all the time, but you give it nonetheless. And therefore, it's like, okay, so if you are not going to serve my agenda or my personal agenda, I will remove your advisory function, right? That is a red flag, because what you're doing, you're reducing your secretary to a pedal pusher. You're reducing the secretary to a note taker, right? And the secretary is no longer considered a senior position in the organization. And that is a threat to the independence of the secretary, right? And in my experience, it came from you seeing what the particular person or group of persons doesn't want to hear. Next slide. Inappropriate reporting lines. To whom should the company secretary report? Yeah, should the company secretary report to one individual? And I'll phrase these points in question format, so that at the end of the presentation, you can also give your views. I will give my views here, but you can give your views to some of these questions that I have. The company secretary, I was asked one time, who do you report to? I said, I report to the board. I report to the board through the chairman. I think it's a little bit different from reporting to the chairman. I'm accountable to the board. The secretary is responsible to the board and should be accountable to the board through the chair on all matters relating to governance and their duties as an officer of the company, right? Should the company secretary report to one individual? Sometimes you have an administrative link, because yes, we have administrative functions. We have to take leave, so not our entire duties isn't around providing governance support to the board. So there may be instances where we have to have a reporting line to the CEO, but it should be to the board, right, through the chairman. That is my view on that, right? With respect to other executive administrative matters, you can report, I think the secretary can report to the CEO. The secretary can report to a director that the board gives a certain responsibility to, that the board has assigned responsibility for a particular matter to a director on a particular matter. So the secretary can report to that one director on that matter. But no secretary, I don't think any secretary should report to a director unless that director has been specifically given the authority by the board as a whole. Yeah, so we have a responsibility as a secretary to be accountable to the board as a whole. So if it is that you're being asked to do something that, let's say an individual, the board has made a decision on a particular matter, you are to follow that decision. And you have to make sure the persons follow the decision of the board. It was a board approved decision in a meeting. So what if a particular director disagrees with the board decision and comes and asks you to do something against that decision? You have to know your reporting lines and where your accountability lies. Yeah. Next slide. The dual role of the general counsel and the company's secretary. Many organizations, I see, they're, general counsel / company secretary. I think things could get confused there where the reporting lines are not clear. The general counsel usually reports to the CEO, right? In the organizations that I've worked at, the general counsel reports to the CEO. The company secretary is responsible to the board, reports to the board through the chairman, right? What if the CEO and the chairman do not see eye to eye? That happens many times. What if the CEO wants to do a particular thing and the chairman and the board has a different perspective on things? Remember, the company secretary is still a human being, right? So your boss, the CEO as general counsel, has asked for your advice on a particular matter, right? You may see the CEO as your boss, right? Not that you're going to advise something that is against the law, but you may advise something that you think would please your boss, right? But what if you're not saying anything that is against the law, but what if when it comes to the board, right, the particular advice is not necessarily for the benefit of the long-term interest of the company? Say, for example, I remember we had a situation where I worked for a state enterprise, right? There's certain, in Trinidad and Tobago, we have what we call the State Enterprise Performance Monitoring Manual, right? And there are certain institutions that are mandated to adhere to the State Enterprise Performance Monitoring Manual. And there was good advice in the manual particularly in terms of procurement and minutes being sent. And so there are a bunch of guidelines in there. And there's certain state enterprises that must comply with it. We were not one of the organizations that must comply with it, right? But given our dependence on Corporation Sole, on the Ministry of Finance, we were not listed as an institution that must do certain things. But I would advise that we do certain things, right, in the interest of the organization. At that point in time, I think about 80% of the institution's revenue came from Corporation Sole. So while we were not listed as an organization that must comply with the manual, in many instances, I think we should send our minutes to the investment for the approval of Corporation Sole, simply because that the amount of money that's being put into the organization. So while it may not be the letter of the law that we do it, right? And the CEO may go to general counsel and say, well, based on what the manual says and based on what the letter of the law says, we don't necessarily have to do that, right? But if it is that when we sit and we wear our hat as company secretary in the boardroom, is that the best advice to give to the board? Is what is legal the best advice to give to the board? Is what is legal what we should do? So a general counsel and company secretary, you may find yourself in a conflict. Which hat do you wear when you're in the boardroom? Which hat do you wear? What happens in cases of agency conflict? Agency conflict where the agent, the directors, are the directors are the agents of the principal, being the shareholders. Yeah, the shareholders have more of a long-term interest in the company, right? They want to see long-term returns. Directors, on the other hand, may have their bonuses tied to profits, to annual profits. So their interests might be more short-term, right? So they may want to, yes, work within the law to facilitate their short-term vision. But if it is that you're a dual counsel and company secretary at the same time, right? Your general counsel, you're reporting to the CEO who has certain agenda, who has a certain agenda to gain profits at the end of the particular year, to have bonuses, right? Is that really what should be done for the long-term benefits of the shareholders, which is what the company secretary is trying to protect? So sometimes, right, if you're not careful, you could find that one individual holding both hats in a bit of a conflict. So who do we serve? Inappropriate remuneration policies and procedures. Who are to determine the company secretary's remuneration, right? And because we work for a salary, and human beings, in our minds, we need our salary. We need our salary to live, right? Sometimes if that one individual with unrestricted power is determining our salary, we may tend to not want to displease that person. Again, human beings are dealing. We may now want to put aside the selflessness that is required and do something that may please an individual, because this is the person that determines our salary. This person can, we may erroneously think that this person can increase or reduce our salary on a whim, right? So to guard against these human weaknesses that we all have, who ought to really determine the company secretary's remuneration, right? In some organizations, there's a remuneration committee, and the remuneration committee is responsible for the salaries, setting the salaries and remuneration policies of executive management. And I think that should include the company secretary as well. And who is on that remuneration committee? And the remuneration committee is charged with developing policies and procedures that are to guide executive remuneration. The remuneration committee should not have executive directors on it, right? The remuneration committee should be non-executive directors. I remember I worked somewhere, and the remuneration of not just the secretary, of any officer, had to be approved by our line ministry, right? Had to be approved by our line ministry. So you see sometimes in the state sector, you can see where there's opportunity for political interference. Because even though the legislation says it must be approved by line ministry, by the line minister, even within the line ministry, there is to be procedures and policies governing the steps as to how that compensation package is approved or not approved, right? To avoid salaries being discussed and approved at political rallies, for example. So there must be clear guidelines, right, that restrict bias, that have to the policies and procedures regarding compensation must eliminate any opportunity for bias and prejudice, right? So, because if it does, it can be a threat to the independence of the company secretary, who may in turn want to secure the salary and do something that is wrong for a particular salary. Next slide. Inappropriate appointment and termination policies and procedures. Who ought to be responsible for appointing and terminating the company's secretary? Should it be just one individual with unrestricted power? No, right? So even if you have sometimes in some organizations, you have a very powerful chairman, right? A powerful chairman, which is good in some circumstances, but sometimes it allows for what we call group think. The directors are there, They are supposed to function in a particular way, but they're really not. They're just going along with what one powerful person really wants, right? So in a situation such as that, which exists probably much more than we would care to think about, who should be responsible for appointing and terminating the company secretary? In some organizations, you have a nomination committee. And yes, I may be speaking of these committees, which you might say is really for large organizations. But even for small private organizations, you could start thinking in that vein that the company secretary be given the importance of the position. Its appointment, termination must be free from bias and prejudice. Right? So you have a nomination committee, right, which is responsible for not just appointing the company secretary, but also the directors as well. There's a process. There's a clear and distinct process as to how directors, as well as the company secretary, is appointed, right? The appraisal of the performance of the company secretary, should it just be in the hands of one reporting officer? Given that the company secretary the role is so multifaceted, you have interaction with the managers, you have interaction with shareholders, you have interaction with stakeholders, with regulators, with suppliers, with employees. So the performance of the company secretary involves a lot of different groups, right? Perhaps we could think about having an external evaluation depending on how the internal workings of the board are. You can have an external evaluator come in, and that external evaluator can interview management. How has the company secretary been performing? So it's not just up to one individual as to how the secretary is performing and whether or not the secretary should be terminated or appointed, right? It's a complete and transparent process. So the next slide, the CEO Chair Secretary Tripartite Alliance. I was introduced to this. I remember being called into an office and I was told that the three of us should stick together, right? This is a meeting with the chairman, the CEO, and myself. The three of us should stick together, and it sounds good, strength in numbers. But really and truly, where does my duty lie? Again, my duty lies to the company. My duty by Section 99 lies to the company. What happens if the interests of the alliance conflicts with company interests? Right? Do I say, okay, well, I'm in an alliance and the three of us should stick together? This happens more often than you think, right? And sometimes in the state sector, right? The state sector, the government of the day appoints its board, right? So most times the board of state enterprises are put there by the government of the day, right? You have the reality of political interference, right? Sometimes even the chairman of a state board might view themselves as a politician, so to speak. I've heard those terms. It's like, well, yes, we have to go with the policies of the government of the day. And of course, we have to do that. But the secretary's role, the independence must be maintained. And we still have to guide you based on what is correct and right to do in the particular circumstance, having regard to the law, having regard to stakeholder considerations, having regard to all the information that is before us, and not necessarily any political agenda. So not every time that CEO, Chair, Secretary, Tripartite Alliance could work. It could be a compromise to the company secretary's independence. So that is my final point. And I just want to say, to close, that the secretary's job many times is an uphill battle. Many times you're swimming against the tide. So you must be fearless. You must be willing to face some battles and to win some. But all in all, apart from the challenges associated with the position, it is a very fulfilling position. It is a very fulfilling job. You're basically protecting the board. You're protecting the organization. You're the vanguard. You're the conscience of the organization. And while you may have little fights in between and some challenges in between, at the end of the day, if you really apply the concepts of selflessness and fearlessness and leadership and all of these traits, you bring all of your positive traits to the position, it really can be fulfilling. And so I will end with that. And if you have any questions at all or any things to share, please feel free to do that.
Thank you so very much, Ceronne. That presentation did not disappoint at all.
Thank you.
There are so many great issues that you raised. But I want to tell you that my key takeaway, there were a lot, but my key takeaway from listening to you was that even if persons are trained as lawyers, a critical skill seems to be that ability to have that emotional intelligence to deal with the many issues that a corporate secretary need to contend with if you're going to fulfill your role properly. So I know we have a lot of corporate secretaries here with us, some very experienced ones, including two of our directors. And I know Faye is here. She has her hand up already. So I will just step back and allow the discussion now to proceed. So Faye, we begin with you.
Thank you, Kamala, and thank you, Ceronne. I think that was a very good presentation, very comprehensive, and you hit a lot of home truths. I'm trying to lower my hand. Yeah, there it is. No, I do have a personal issue with this whole question of the joint general counsel company secretary role, and I wouldn't like to take over your presentation discussing that. So I think, Kamala, we do have that session on YouTube or a recorded link. Because there are two sides to the story. And I would say my personal view is sometimes there's a misunderstanding of the general counsel role of being you advise on the law. I think when you're general counsel at a very senior level in the organization, you do have that big picture. You do tell your CEO and your board, this is the law, but this is the impact, and do you want that impact, and are you prepared to go with it? So I would just make that point and recommend that maybe Kamala, you could circulate again the link to that recording, because there are two sides to the story. But excellent job, very thorough, and I'm sure we would recommend you to do some presentations for us, Kamala. Yes.
Yes.
Very good job. Great presentation.
Thank you.
I'll shut up now and let other people speak.
Yes. So and yes, so we would share that recorded again, because I thought that was a brilliant session we had as well when we looked at a court case that looked at the whole issue of the corporate secretary and address the issue as the corporate secretary in the role as a legal attorney as well. There's a really good question in the chat from Misha as well, so I'm going to ask that, Ceronne, and then I'm inviting everyone. If you have a comment or a question, you can raise your hands or you could put it on the chat, either way, so we could invite you to be part of the discussion. Misha, are you able to unmute and ask your question, or would you prefer for me to read it out here for you in the chat? Because we'd be happy to have.
Kamala, thank you. I don't mind you. I'm a bit very nasal, and I'm not sure if Ceronne would be able to hear me clearly, so I don't mind you asking at all.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Misha. So what she has put in the chat, and of course, great presentation, which we all think. And she's asking, she said there are companies that designate the executive director or CEO as the company secretary. Is this a conflict of interest?
The company secretary, I believe, is to advise and maintain that impartiality. So yes, if you are the CEO, you have certain proposals that you would put before your board to approve, and you're basically wearing the two hats, you're advising your board to approve your own proposal. So I do see the conflict there. right? Many times, sometimes a company secretary, because of the skills and the attributes associated with becoming a company secretary, can eventually become a CEO. But I don't think we should be wearing both hats at the same time. Yeah.
Now, there are instances where it occurs, Ceronne. So I would think what it requires to a great extent, because I would say that it may be acceptable as a short-term measure if there's a board that is looking to change corporate secretaries for whatever reason, or in fact, you know, there are organizations where the company secretary is not really given this role effectively the way you would have described it. So you may find that if someone is acting in the position of a corporate secretary there, the board then will need to be that much more vigilant to ensure that the information that's coming before them is really the information, because at least I would think, so clarify for me if I have a misunderstanding in the area as well. For the most part, the board papers that will go before the board is not necessarily that of the corporate secretary. It's management's reports generally coming through the CEO. So that the corporate secretary function is really more of a vehicle. And what you want is the integrity of that individual to ensure that, you know, that relationship that is managed between the board and management is effectively done. So it can be anyone, including a CEO, so long as there's this awareness that it's not the ideal situation and should not.
Yes, I do. There must be, and I agree with the fact that it can be done as a temporary measure, short term. It can't be but this is the way it is kind of thing. Yeah.
Yes, because I will tell you, I know in the state sector in Trinidad and Tobago in particular, you know, sometimes they don't see the importance of the company secretary, and boards have to function without one. So sometimes it is the CEO who steps in and serves that role. And I see Shivanjali has also contributed in the chat. Shivanjali, can I ask you to share as well so that everyone benefits and can engage with you too?
I was actually just agreeing with Ceronne, and you know, well, you as well, Kamala, in light of your explanation, while it does happen, especially with state enterprises and smaller companies, it is undesirable and not in the interest of the company to have the CEO, who already carries a hefty burden and very hefty duties and responsibilities, to also have to take up the responsibilities of a company secretary whose duties and responsibilities are very much different from that of a CEO. But I do take your point that it does in fact happen, although it is not in the interest of proper corporate governance.
Mm-hmm. Right, thank you, Shivanjali. And I see Camille has her hand up. Of course, Camille, we are happy to have you join the conversation.
Yes. So I wanted to agree that it should be avoided. Mm-hmm. Because when you think about it, the corporate secretary in that advisory role, as Siobhan so clearly explained, will sometimes be saying to that executive director that this needs to go through a particular process. Mm-hmm. And that executive director is going to be, railing against to do all of this or follow this procedure. It's just bureaucratic. It's unnecessary. So I think in circumstances like those, it would perhaps be better to have another director rather than the executive director have that dual role of director secretary, because directors under the law have that same responsibility to the organization to act in the best interest of the organization. So by right, directors and the secretary, their objectives ought to be aligned. Their responsibility, their duty to the company, their fiduciary responsibilities are the same. But I would really think it would be best to avoid the executive director being in that role. That would be my perspective on it. Having done this job and the joint job of counsel and for many years. I think so. The other thing I would want to say is that there's a practice now of the company secretary being evaluated as a part of the board evaluation. So, Ceronne, I think that that is something that I think could assist in that independent evaluation.
Mm-hmm. And if I may raise a point that Ceronne raised, a question she asked, and who should the company secretary report to? What are persons' views on that?
No, definitely the company secretary reports to the board through the chair. There should be no doubt about that.
Mm-hmm. Right. Does anyone have any question around that specific thing? Because what also happens at time is there can be conflict, just as Ceronne explained. When there's a conflict between the CEO and the chairman of the board, for instance, and managing that whole relationship now as to who you report to, because your chairman, is not necessarily frequently around the way that your CEO would be. So yes, Faye, I see you have your hand up.
Right. Yeah, I think, I think there's value certainly to the board, and the board has to play a role. The company secretary needs to have access to the board through the chairman, and there needs to be appraisal by the company secretary by the board. But from a practical aspect, more and more, there are more and more executive roles that are being seen as independent. I firmly hold the view the general counsel needs to be independent. I don't believe in this general counsel does what the CEO tells them. You are doing your job. Sorry, that's my view as an attorney. Because if you have a client, you don't do what the client doesn't tell you what to do. You tell the client what the options are, and they choose to do what they want to do. But you have internal audit who has to, you want a direct line to the audit committee. The audit committee is supposed to, they report to the audit committee. Risk reports to whether it's the risk committee or the audit committee. And you have more and more of these senior positions being expected to report directly to the board. And a lot of time, the board just is not resourced to have a full reporting responsibility. So you have to have that dual reporting line. I don't think you can avoid it, because the CEO is interacting day to day with the company secretary or the internal audit. They have a view as well that needs to be taken into account. And as a company secretary, going to write the chairman, can I have 2 weeks off, or I have to sign my medical form? So I think from a practical perspective, and what you really want to work towards is developing a relationship among the key players in that group that is informed enough in the process of corporate governance to have the confidence to be able to deal with issues and raise issues when they come up. And I think one of the points, actually there were 2 points I wanted to make. One of them is a bit of an aside to Ceronne's, non-legal company secretary. Not all lawyers can be company secretaries. The law says they can, but many of them are totally incompetent in that role. So it's not enough to just have a legal qualification. But the boards have to understand their responsibilities. And a lot of the time, boards sort of allow CEOs to run the show, or allow management to, they need to be educated in their responsibilities and the need for things like an independent company secretary. So I think every board is different, and there's always that little careful balance that you need to achieve, and which is why this question of emotional intelligence is more and more and more important. Company secretary needs to understand how to influence and communicate with all the players he or she has to communicate with.
And to a very another issue which Ceronne raised too, and that is the evolving role of the corporate secretary as advisor to the board. Now, it would be interesting to get persons' feedback in terms of whether directors have shown that willingness to be advised and guided by the corporate secretary. Yes, Gail.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're hearing me.
Afternoon. Yes.
Okay. So it's interesting that you just raised that question, Kamla, because the comment that I was going to make kind of dovetails a little bit into it. So first of all, Ceronne, thank you. Just what I expected, a well-informed, well-researched presentation, and I really appreciate that approach that you took. But I just want to say to the point about the corporate secretary, the role as trusted advisor to the board. I have to say, in my experience, and let me raise my hand and say I am a general counsel and corporate secretary. So, Faye, I'm very much with you. I think that session that the CCGI had in respect of that particular case and the discussions that we had at that session are very informative because there are two sides, and I have seen two sides in my experience as well. But the whole idea of the corporate secretary as trusted advisor to the board just brings me back to the point that I was going to kind of throw out there, which is that I also believe that boards have a role in ensuring that their corporate secretaries are protected in the sense that they must understand the role of their corporate secretary. They must be willing to be advised by their corporate secretary. They must understand that they have a role in the independence of their corporate secretary. And how they do that is reflected by the decisions that they take and how they are advised and what they communicate even to the CEO. You talk about the tripartite. And it has been the experience of persons that I know as well, that tripartite doesn't always work in the way that it should. So you have to ask yourself in a situation like that, whether the corporate secretary through the chairman and the board will receive sufficient support, given that maybe that's not working as it should. The other thing that I wanted to just point I wanted to make, because I kind of took some notes from Ceronne, is this whole idea of the removal of the advisory function. I really like that section that you did, Ceronne, about the company secretary being reduced to a note taker and a pedal pusher, because it is a very real thing. Let me tell you, it is a very real thing. And I want to also tie that to the comment I want to make about the combination of general counsel and corporate secretary. Because Ceronne, one of the points you made was this idea that corporate secretary may not be considered a senior enough position in organizations. I've also seen that. And there is even a school of thought that thinks that without the combination of general counsel and corporate secretary, the corporate secretary function by itself is not senior, is not to be respected in the same way as other executive positions. And it is a very dangerous and slippery slope when we take that approach, because governance is just as important as commercial advice, it's just as important as legal advice. And I would argue in some cases, perhaps even more important because of the consequences for the organization. So I just wanted to kind of touch on those things, because I thought, based on my own experience and things that I've heard as well, that the combination of the two may lead to some other issues or some other considerations that you always have to bear in mind. But I do believe strongly that boards also have to be on board with their governance advisor and understand the role and support the role.
Yes, very good, Gail. Thank you so much for that. And I saw Sabrina's request in the chat for us to put the link to the recording for that significant court judgment session, which we are discussing. So I've asked Christy if she can, because Christy is also managing the session for us. So I'm not sure if she'd be able to, Sabrina, but certainly it is available. All of our recorded events, the links to them are available on our website, so persons can check that out after. And pretty soon I'm going to have that session ready to post on our YouTube channel as well. So it may be easier for you to be able to access it there as well. Now, I wondered how many persons experienced or know of the situation that Ceronne mentioned at the start of her presentation as well, where there are directors' expectation that the corporate secretary is no more than someone who takes notes. And that's it, a very purely administrative function. Are you coming across that kind of attitude still in and among directors? Yes, Misha.
Kamala, I think that's the exact reason why I raised my original question, because that kind of limited perspective in terms of the role of the corporate sector is what then allows companies to err in terms of feeling that the role can be done by the executive director, or as you know, and it is even written in some bylaws that I have come across. Granted, it's not a board, but it's a council that they have, but they still see the executive director as being one that the bylaw says, oh, the executive director should also be the corporate secretary. And I'm glad that this discussion is happening, because it gives people like myself who are aware of organizations like these to be able to direct them to sessions like these that are being held by CCGI, or even play a role as a member of CCGI to start sensitizing persons to that this is an error, and it puts the company and the company's governance structure at risk. But it's happening, and that is why I raised that point. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Amisha. So there is need for us to be able to continue to engage people and their understanding with respect to how important the role of the corporate secretary is. Because when you have a very effective corporate secretary, it can make such a huge difference to the quality of governance you have in the boardroom. And I see Nova is putting something in the chat first. Nova, may I invite you to join in and share your point of view with us?
Yes, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for the invitation. I am currently an executive secretary. I'm part of the secretariat, and I work alongside company secretary within a private organization where the secretary is usually elected on a yearly basis. And I have witnessed that in our organization, the company secretary is regarded as a note taker simply. No advisory or vanguard kind of position.
Yes, and what that means, therefore, is that the directors themselves now will not be open to advice and guidance. So when Ceronne spoke to directors wanting their own way, but the corporate secretary needing to use your word, Nova, to be that vanguard, to ensure you protect the organization itself. I'm pretty sure that then makes it so much more challenging. But Ceronne, I want to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit for us on that tripartite that you mentioned.
Yes, the CEO, Chairman, Secretary Alliance. I put it in there because it happened to me. You know, I was called into a meeting with the chairman and the CEO, and the fact that we should stick together came up. You know, we should stick together, you know, and there's strength in numbers, right? So, but not every time, remember, you're dealing with individuals, human beings, right? So I can stick with you as long as your motive is tied to what is beneficial for the company, right? So I had to make it very clear where my duty lies, not necessarily in the alliance and the individuals, because we have to be honest with ourselves. Many times what we want for ourselves is not what is best for the organization, you know, and it takes a great deal of effort to put away self, right? So what I had to say is that in as much as what the alliance wants is what is in line with the company, yeah, you'll have me on board, but don't expect a blind loyalty to the alliance, right? That would compromise my position and be detrimental to the company. The duty is to the company. Right? So I just wanted to make that very clear, because in actual day-to-day practice, it's very easy to get distracted. Very, very easy to get distracted. Human nature.
Yeah. And if I may use an example from Trinidad and Tobago that's pretty major. Many of you would remember the case of the Hindu Credit Union. And during the Commission of Inquiry, quite a lot of information came out about the poor governance of the organization. And we learned about the corporate secretary being asked to create minutes for meetings which never existed. And, you know, simply rubber stamping a lot of the requests of the president. So when we talk about protecting the interests of the organization, you know, it is so crucial, because it could lead to something as drastic as that, you know, the collapse of the entire organization. Yes, Camille.
Yes, to the point about the tripartite grouping, we also have to bear in mind that that same grouping can simply change the corporate secretary, unless it is that there is a system whereby the corporate secretary is evaluated by, as I said, through the board evaluation process by all the board, or some independent process, as Ceronne alluded to. They will simply, if you do not do what they want you to do, they will remove you.
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, when we talk about dealing with realities, that would be one of them. Now, we also have to remember too, that governance has changed. The role of the corporate secretary has changed so drastically from when I started over 35 years ago, because I too have always had that position, legal corporate secretary. And the reality was you paid attention to legal, and it was minute taking that your secretary did for the board. Then you had the Enrons and the Cadbury committees of the world, and these things happened in the 70s and the 80s. And suddenly now, governance really took on a life of its own. So even as we speak today, it's an evolving role. And a lot of the directors, especially the older ones, they go back to an earlier era where the corporate secretary was, you know, did not have the role he or she has today. So I just wanted to throw that into the mix.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Camille. Yes, Faye?
Yeah, that is such a tricky one, because it also highlights the role that we tend to give the chairman, which is undeserving in terms of controlling the decision making. Because if you actually have that group working together, you could run away with the board. So the directors on the board need to understand that the chairman following what the chairman says. And so it can be a very, very dangerous grouping. And when you see you have boards where everybody's just sort of, well, if that's what the chairman wants, then, you know, if I were you, I would get off that board fast, unless you could change things, because you are exposing yourself there. So it's very, very dangerous to have any kind of cabal and grouping, I think, in the boardroom. You know, that everyone has an independent role to play. Each director has to represent the company independently. Chairman is not the boss, CEO is not the boss, he's the boss of the company, or she's the boss of the company. It could be very dangerous. And but as Camille pointed out, if you don't play ball, you know, you could be off.
Yeah, and those are some real challenges that are faced, because you're doing your job as best as you can in accordance with what legislation and what you're supposed to be doing, but human nature and human frailty, you know. So, and many times what should be is not what is, you know, what should be is not what is, right? So when it is the non-executive directors on a board should be strong individuals should provide, bring their expertise and provide that constructive challenge that I haven't really seen in my professional life thus far. So in terms of when the secretary is not going with the flow, we often have to go against the tide, often, What do we do? Who appraises us? So that's why I alluded to an excellent appraisal. Speak to management, get the views of everyone that the company secretary is supposed to interact with.
And sometimes in the role, you have to drive some of that yourself, because if you sometimes you don't have the control to have the CEO take that step. So sometimes you have to drive it yourself by voluntarily subjecting yourself to a 360 degree by your executives who deal with you with board papers or whatever. And I think that when company secretaries demonstrate that initiative, they build the right foundation to be able to move on to those kind of external things. But in many ways, it kind of comes back to some of the issues we have with state corporations. Like how independent and putting yourself on the line are you going to be when your tenure is maybe 1 year or 2 years, and you don't know if you're going to get re-elected, or if you don't do what the minister wants, they just show you the door. So we need to fix our state organizations. We can't have proper governance when you have that environment. So at least that's my view. I think it's shared by a lot of people.
So let's talk then about developing that skill set of the corporate secretary, because how do you manage when there's conflict at the board, even, because a lot then depends on the maturity of the corporate secretary to help in whether it is how a note may be drafted, so the right information is shared, or what would you recommend, Ceronne? Are there like mediation type programs that you would recommend for corporate secretaries? Should we do something at CCGI about developing emotional intelligence for corporate secretaries?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there are many company secretaries that suffer in silence, right? Because we're always going against the tide. And so, the training sessions, just sessions where we can all come together and say, you're not alone in the fight. Some sort of, I don't know if you would call it group therapy, right? Yeah. But some way where they can hear from other company secretaries, I'm in there with you as well. And that could help build their strength to go into work the next day. Sometimes it's a real challenge to go into work the next day. I use my faith a lot. I'll be honest, I use my faith, and it helps me in my profession. And eventually, as I said, when you put aside the challenges, there are many challenges, I guess, we would face in any profession. It could be really fulfilling, even though no one around the table wants to hear what you say. Nobody's nobody wants to hear what you have to say. There's a sense of fulfillment that I feel when I say it, regardless, when I do it afraid, So it could be really rewarding. It could be a really rewarding profession, in spite of if you can just set aside the nonsense.
And me that, I keep saying we need to develop a forum that allows our corporate secretaries to be able to come together and network. I've been trying to find what that solution would be, because I realize a lot of our corporate secretaries information, it's some very confidential type things that you may want to share and want to get advice and support with. So there needs to be a forum. Ceronne, I'm going to ask you to help me with this too, because I've heard persons say that, being a corporate secretary, you can feel so alone and you can feel so isolated because there's no one else who holds the unique perspective that you do. And so it's helpful, to have that network and that ability to be able to come. Now, we do get, I would share with persons, we do get a number of questions and calls from corporate secretaries from time to time, asking for advice and guidance and those kinds of things. Sometimes I will ask Faye to provide some information, which is then passed on and that kind of thing. But what I have come to realize too is there are times when a corporate secretary just wants to be heard. They want an air. You want a place to be able to share. This is what I'm facing, you know, and it would be good to be able to provide that too. Yes, Camille, I see that your hand is up as well.
Yeah, and I don't think we should overlook what Ceronne is saying about the job being a really fulfilling job. And I must tell you, there have not been that many situations in my career where it's been adversarial, right? Perhaps I have been lucky. But if they respect your views, if they think you are knowledgeable, if the board thinks you are knowledgeable, they will respect your views. And also the relationship with the CEO is not supposed to be adversarial. The CEO is practically to consider, in my humble estimation, the corporate secretary his best friend, because she's the one who is going to come to him and say, remember, you're supposed to present A, B, and C to the board. Your finance is supposed to be doing this. Operations is supposed to be doing that. Let me have the papers 7 days before so the board can get them on time so that the CEO can look good, can go into the boardroom looking prepared, right? She's the one who's going to run interference for him. Oh, the chairman is feeling this way, you know, I think we need to, because she's that bridge between management and the board. I think we could do this to make the situation better. So very often there is a close relationship, a close, legal, proper relationship with great respect between the CEO and the corporate secretary, because she's not supposed to be there trying to throw blows at him. No, she's there to act in the best interest of the organization, as he should be, and everybody should be working toward the same objectives. So I think sometimes it's how we approach things that, you know, if we looked at it a little differently, it may lead to a different result.
Yes, exactly. Because in fact, I'm just remembering. So I'm on the board of PMI SCC as well, which is, you know, a voluntary membership organization like ours. And our president was making the point about bringing information before the membership. And I was able to share there's a procedure that needs to be followed. And sometimes that's what CEOs need. They may desire certain things to happen, but there is a process to be followed, which they may not be aware of because they're not trained in that area. And so, you know, you should be able to depend on your corporate secretary for that kind of advice and support. So I know that a lot of persons who are in the room now are actually attorneys at law. So am I as well. So we may have a very different type perspective in terms of how we carry out the function. It would be great to hear from anyone in the room who works as a corporate secretary but don't have any legal training at all. Because I know, Ceronne, you have your degree in law. So there is an amount of legal training that you've had as well. But do we have any persons who are in the room, you know, and want to share with us how they manage and fulfill their role as a corporate secretary, being a non-legal person? And given the practice that a corporate secretary is usually an attorney, I'm probably not going to get many persons who aren't, because I'm looking at persons in the room and I know, okay, this person is also legal counsel, this person. So the majority of persons are in fact attorneys. But yes, we have a hand up, and that's Chazelle Fleming. Chazelle, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. So yes, and then we'll hear from Michelle as well. So go ahead. Chazelle.
Hi everyone. My situation is a little bit different. So I'm not really sure. I almost didn't raise my hand because I felt like maybe I shouldn't, but I recently was voted in as the secretary of the Harvard Club, which is a members club. And they have the same kind of format where there's the chairman, the honorary secretary, and then the treasurer, and that kind of situation. I have no legal background. And so it was a real learning curve for me, because I was approached, because I'm the first female, sorry, I should put that, I'm the first woman that they've ever elected to be the honorary secretary of the club. So that immediately changed the role that I had, because the secretaries before, they were more in a role where they would take on the daily functions. They would direct direct the club and direct the direction, sorry, that they want the club to go in. And then for me, they were like, oh no, you can just take minutes. And I was, I was like, wait. I referred to the club rules, and I had to highlight and say, but based on the club rules, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. I have all of these functions. And they were like, oh, no, it's, you're new, don't worry about it. The chairman will take a bit. You just come and you just take minutes. And it was a shock for me, because I had to ask the question, if I were a man, would my role have changed? And sometimes I wonder if, because I don't have that kind of legal background, because they tend to respect lawyers a bit more, attorneys a bit more. Sometimes I wonder if, because I don't have that background, there is this, like, am I capable of it? I'm trying my best, but I do have reservations sometimes about my ability to fulfill the role.
Mm-hmm. Understood, Shazal. And yes, I could quite see where your being female plays a big part in their perception as to how you will fulfill that function as well. So it really is a big hurdle to overcome in terms of people's socialization process and their expectation, in terms of how we function. So Michelle had also put up her hand as someone who is...
That's correct.
Yeah.
My background is in HR. So I'm the HR specialist in TOSL Engineering Limited. As you guys may know, it's a family-owned business. I'm one of the daughters. So that's how I got introduced into the position, to learn a little more about the organization. No, I don't have a legal background, but fortunately at TOSL, we have lawyers who assist me at times when I need that guidance. But I feel sometimes, I'm just the note taker, the minute person. And sometimes I do question my roles and responsibilities. So thanks, Ceronne, for helping out with giving me some guidance with that.
Sure.
So what we are seeing is, in fact, that directors do tend to prefer that their corporate secretaries are attorneys. Otherwise, they just see them as there to write the minutes. Hi, Gail. Yes, I see your hand up.
No, I am so happy that Shazal, I think, was so honest about not even wanting to put her hand up. And let me just say, Shazal, you have a seat at the table as everyone else does, as anyone else does. And as Faye mentioned earlier, there are some attorneys who are in no way qualified to be corporate secretaries. It's not suited to every temperament. It's not suited to every level of emotional intelligence. And let me encourage you by saying that, see this as definitely a challenge. You have a real green field in front of you. You have the ability to build relationships, to change, to advise, to counsel in ways that these, let me not call them old boys, may not have ever seen and ever experienced. And you will be faced with challenges because of that. But I want to suggest that you have a golden opportunity in front of you to really shape this organization differently, because of the fact that you are a non-legal person and you are the first female. So congrats very much on that. And even Michelle, sometimes in family organizations, it's even more challenging because there's personal relationships to contend with. And if you're truly playing the role of a corporate secretary in the way that it's meant to play, you will. I mean, Ceronne talked about being fearless. I want to suggest in a family environment that you have to have a water off ducks back kind of approach as well to some extent, because that will definitely be required.
Good. Thank you, Gail. Yes, Kimberly, hi. I see your hand up. And Gail, thank you so much for that encouragement and support for Shazal. You are quite right. You know, sometimes these challenges give us an opportunity to be able to rise and shine. Yes, Kimberly.
Hi. Okay, so I do have a legal background. However, I have been placed in an institution, a financial institution. So that is something new to me. It is out of my league, but being here, I have been extremely progressing very much in the aspect of compliance and being able to help them, you know, understand the law and what it requires and all of that from the company as that aspect. I have a VP that is wonderful. She is the kind of woman that encourages you to be your best self and really pushes you to put yourself out there and do more with your life and all of that. So I'm very grateful for that. Yet the majority of persons it is very male dominated. So, you know, sometimes when you feel, you know, you're out there doing your best and you're really pushing hard and you have a lot to offer and stuff like that, they don't really like view you as that person that contributes that much to the organization. And I think it's the whole aspect of getting to actually know what the people in your organization does and how they contribute and what is their output at the end of the day, to educate yourselves really on what they do. I think that is the gap that needs to be bridged in order for you to fully understand, you know, what you have to offer, how you could help the organization build itself or take it a step further and all of that. Yeah. So that is basically one of my challenges.
Yes. Thank you very much, Kimberly. And not to add to the burden, but you know, Ceronne also mentioned that corporate secretaries now also carry a personal responsibility. You know, you are an officer of the company, just as directors would be. You therefore have fiduciary duties to ensure that you look after the long-term interests of the organization. So, you know, let me just ask you, how many of you may feel unprepared to be personally responsible for some of the decisions being made in the organization? Because in carrying out your role, you know, that is part of your function, to ensure that you are serving the interests of the organization, and failure to do so could mean a personal responsibility to do so. And Lana has shared with us in the chat. Lana, would you like to unmute and join the conversation with us? Okay, so I'm not sure if she's able to, but I will just share what she has in the chat, which is that she's now pursuing her degree in law and her aim, and is in her final semester. So, okay, and she's at work right now. So we are happy to have you still connected with us and listening in, Lana. So she says it's interesting to listen in on where I may be able to go and what I may be able to achieve. Yes, great discussion. Now I want to also underscore several persons who made the point that being a corporate secretary can be a very, very fulfilling role. You know, you're in a unique position to see the growth of the organization and to see it from all angles. You're able to be part of what is happening at the management level and the day-to-day operations of the organization, but you also have the opportunity to sit in as an officer, as a governance official, where you see the overview and the direction in which the organization is growing. And I truly believe it takes a particular type of personality to really be effective as a corporate secretary. And that personality is one that requires tremendous strength. And well, Ceronne has shared that a lot, she relies on her faith a lot, because you will often come across situations where there is conflict. You know, it may be conflict between you and the CEO. It may be conflict between you and the chair or another director, you know, and sometimes it's personalities, which then becomes more difficult than if it were a difference of opinion. So understanding how to navigate all that is important, but if it's done well, you know, it's an exciting place to be. Okay, so Lana is asking if there is a specific path to take to become a corporate secretary, or is it just that you need to send in your resume when the advertisement comes out and wait? Let me ask you guys to answer that. What does it take to become a corporate secretary? And should you just accept the role? Ceronne, you want to go?
I would advocate that a company secretary have knowledge of the law. Yeah, not necessarily, yes, an attorney at law, but not necessarily an attorney at law, but you should have knowledge of the law. So I would, like, anyone wants to become a company secretary, pursue your LLB, pursue a law degree. I would always advocate for the MBA, because the legal, it's more than just a legal role, right? You really have to understand organizations and how they work, so that you can properly advise the board, because the board is there overseeing the entire organization, different aspects, you know, financial, HR, all the different elements of the organization, the board is there to govern. So the MBA is a good addition to that as well. And you can become a chartered governance professional, right? So, and I don't think many people know that, right? We know about the chartered accountants, but you can become a chartered governance professional, and which to me is the peak of the profession in terms of qualifications, you know, and it just brings everything together. Boardroom dynamics, risk, everything together in terms of governance. It's a governance certification, right? So yes, pursue if you're an attorney at law, don't just stop there, right? Get your MBA, do other things that will zero in on governance, right? I don't think it's simply enough to be an attorney at law.
Yeah, and I want to agree and add to what you're saying, Ceronne. Absolutely, I am an advocate for the MBA. Everyone should do an MBA if you're working in an organization, because it really opens your eyes to how the entire organization function, and therefore how you can be more effective in whichever role you are in. And if I may take this opportunity to also advertise on behalf of CCGI, we do have workshops that teaches the role and function of the corporate secretary. Now, tomorrow's workshop with Faye is going to look at drafting documents like minutes and board resolutions and those kinds of things. So it is a lot more useful for persons who are already in that role. So you will understand how to ensure that there's a proper agenda and those kinds of things. But there is also the role and function of the corporate secretary workshop, which she does, and it's coming up a little later this year. For those of you who are already serving for a very long time in the role, we also have the evolving role, you know, as a governance professional, which Alison does, and it's going to happen at the end of this year. And I also, CCGI has been having conversations with developing a certificate program for corporate secretaries to teach you all of these skills to take you from zero, you know, to that point where you can be effective fulfilling that role in the boardroom as well. And as I mentioned at the in my opening today, that growth of an expansion of CCGI really has needed some support, and we now have a really nice set of applications that have come into us for persons to provide that support service providers. And so we'd be able to move a lot more quickly in that direction to be able to offer those kinds of trainings as well. So if you're interested in it, you can look out. Shazal, I wanted to encourage you, contact us, because you should join the workshop tomorrow with Fee. It's going to be a big help for you. All right, and let me just check the chat quickly. Right, so Delissa is asking you, Ceronne, how does one become a chartered governance professional? So I would want you to answer that, but I think that I see, right, so Christy did put in the chat already. I want to make sure and point this out to you guys. Remember, I asked you for feedback. This is important to us because I want us to be able to continue with providing discussion sessions that are relevant and useful to you. So please go back on the chat and you will see the link that Christy has given. It's a link to SurveyMonkey. It just takes 2 minutes to give us feedback. Please, we are asking that you give us that feedback. So, and we are in fact planning the next free session like this, which will allow us to continue to grow and develop. So let me come back to you, Ceronne, to ask you to answer that question from Delissa with respect to becoming a chartered governance professional.
But I think different regions of the world have different institutions, but there's a Chartered Governance Institute of the UK and Ireland, and they offer a program, a qualifying program to become a chartered governance professional. So you can look them up, the Chartered Governance Institute of UK and Ireland, and they have different entry routes. They have the entry routes through an MBA, they have the entry routes through an attorney, maybe being an attorney or an accountant. But I believe you need to have certain qualifying criteria before you can start. But research that organization, and you can take it from there.
Okay, so that's just the one out of the UK, because there's also one in Canada by the Chartered Governance Institute of Canada, or Governance Practitioners of Canada, I think is their name. They have a good program too. But let me also share, I thought it was a chartered secretary, forgive me. I thought it was a chartered secretary program you were referring to, Ceronne. We too here at CCGI offer a chartered governance program. It is a 3-level program. We are at this point offering the first level, which is the Certificate in Corporate Governance, that's going to be delivered in October of this year. It comprises 4 modules. We will offer that certificate program twice a year. When persons graduate out of that first level, then we move to the diploma level, which we will begin again next year. We haven't had the diploma level since we moved into the online environment, but we'll be moving to that diploma level next. And then our 3rd and final level would be the chartered directorship level. So persons who are interested could certainly come to us as well for that training. And let me also share, apart from the formal training that you get here, real value is being able to continue your learning. Remember, our commitment now to be able to be effective in today's world is continuous learning and development. And being part of a lot of these workshops and training sessions we have at CCGI, including our series like Lessons from the Boardroom, these are really significant in helping you to grow those skills that Ceronne spoke to most in this presentation, which is the ability to understand and manage in very complex situations with a range of diverse personalities, some of whom may have their own agendas. And you have to find ways to protect your reputation and ensure that you are fulfilling your role and function as well. So Yes, Gail has put it on the chat, the Governance Professionals of Canada. They also have a lot of really good training programs as well. And we are in fact connecting with the world to see how we bring in different level experts to be able to share and grow in our own knowledge and understanding. All right, so continue to be connected with us as well, even as you explore what is offered externally. So it is now 2:30, Ceronne. Would you believe it?
Time flies when you're having fun.
Yes, yes. So, Ceronne, let me give you 2 minutes just to wrap up your, any pattern words you have for us before we end our session today.
Yeah, so I would just say, like I said before, the profession, I think, should be respected as a profession in itself, right? The days of seeing a secretary as a note taker was in 1887, right? The 19th century, and now in 2022. That position has no place in 2022. The company secretary is a profession in itself to be respected, right? You don't just become a company secretary just like that, right? There's effort and there's work involved in it to really be effective and to serve the organization in the best way that you can. But when you're there, you really have to know what is right, stick to what is right, do not compromise. There'll be many opportunities to compromise, right? So you know what you're about and you stick to it regardless of what is placed before you. And when you actually do it, you build the respect. You get the respect. You may not be liked, right? But you would get the respect, and it could be a very rewarding profession. I like it regardless of what I've faced in my career.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, Ceronne, I want to thank you so very much. You really, really, lived up to our expectations today. It was very high that we are going to have a very full room, which we did get. That was very engaging, and we learned so much in being able to engage the conversation with you. You are so right. A corporate secretary today is a governance professional. And for us at CCGI, it's important for our corporate secretaries to understand that carrying out their role well is going to mean really effective boardrooms. It's going to mean an improvement in the quality of our governance practices. So we have a vested interest in training you and helping you to be effective.